Hello, and welcome to this panel session, The Role of AI in Today's Connected World. I'm going to be your moderator today, and my name is Peter Dorrington. I'm the founder of Exemplify Consulting, and I'm interested in using natural language understanding to get an insight into why do people do what they do, what they're likely to do next, and what an organization should do with that insight. Now, I'm joined today by a very august panel, and I'm going to introduce them in just a second. We are going to work our way through quite a few questions, but I look forward to hearing what everybody's got to say. So, without further ado, let me go to our first panelist and ask Dr. Fatmah to introduce herself. Over to you, Dr. Fatmah.
Thank you very much. I would like first to mention that I'm very grateful for my university, both UK and Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz University. I have graduated in 2003, majoring in artificial intelligence, and I'm a faculty member at KAU, a member of G20 Task Force 4. I have academic, scientific, managerial, technical, and business expertise, and participated in forming national strategies. I'm the founder and board president of AI Society and IEEE chapter in Saudi Arabia, first woman internationally awarded 2 AI prizes, one from USA and the other one from UK, and first President, Saudi Engineering Society Women. I held several administrative positions inside and outside the university, as a manager for Apple Center, GMIT Security, director for KAEC, educational sector. I have about 30 years of educational expertise, authoring several books and supervised many applied technology projects. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. And going in alphabetical order, my next guest I'd like to introduce herself is my good friend, Lubna Dajani. Lubna, move to you.
Thank you. I'm Lubna Dajani. I am the founder of the Alternate Limited. My educational background is in systems analysis and design. I take a holistic look at technology and its impact on the advances across all fields of science and industry. I'm currently also an advisor to a few public and private CEOs, and I'm a contributor to some of the IEEE standards on ethical AI, as well as an invited expert at W3C on privacy and cognitive AI. I'm really delighted to be here. I thank you all for being part of this panel, and very, very much gratitude to Dr. Fatmah for inviting me. Thank you.
We're delighted to have you, Lubna. So next, I'd like to go to Mark Kellett. Would you mind introducing yourself, Mark?
Yeah, hi. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation, kind invitation to join this rather esteemed panel. They say in life, surround yourself with people who are better than you. And I think in this case, there's lots of people on this panel who are a hell of a lot better than I in the area of AI. But my background, I started life, I come from a physics science background, and for my sins, I then became an accountant, all to do with numbers, right? So it's understanding why things work and how much they cost. But I moved into the technology area. I'm originally from Ireland, but worked in the US, worked in Europe, working for companies like Yahoo, Sun Microsystems, Network Appliance, and more recently moved into the area that is generating vast amount of data supporting this AI explosion, telecoms, and more focused in property and infrastructure technology. So I founded a business recently, Kellett IoT Networks, and we are focused on the very fast-moving property and infrastructure technology space. And also for my sins, I've decided to study at MIT in a course in AI to bring myself up to speed. So that's me. Look forward to talking to you all during the next hour.
Thank you very much, Mark. And finally, last but by no means least, I'd also like to introduce Dr. Mike Short of the Department of International Trade to introduce himself. Over to you, Mike.
Peter, thank you very much for introducing me and also for the opportunity to take part. So I'm currently the Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Government for International Trade, but I bring with that 40 years in electronics and telecommunications. I'm a former chairman of the GSM Association and a former president of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. But my particular interest is to actually help introduce innovation into more and more international markets. And AI is one particular example of that. And I look forward to talking more about that when we can.
Lovely. Thank you, Mike. And thank you all to the panelists for that introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to come back to Mike. My first question then, Mike, is where are we with AI today? And what are the best applications of AI that you've seen? And then I'll ask the rest of the panel. But Mike, over to you first. So clearly there's a lot going on in the field of AI at the moment. What's the best that you've seen so far?
Well, I think first of all, AI depends very heavily on data, and the data availability is not widespread everywhere or in everybody's hands. Clearly, we need to respect data privacy and data trust. But if I take my world of telecommunications, where I've been involved with the launch or the design of 5 generations of mobile networks, clearly the mobile operators hold a lot of data, and they're beginning to use AI in different fields. So the natural area would be networks, as in network planning, particularly to make sure that the right coverage is in the right place. We can start to see also thinking about new sites which would extend coverage and capacity and the resilience of 5G going forward. We can also see AI and big data being processed in billing. So we may get, in customer terms, better pricing recommendations if AI is applied in the billing arena. Particularly when you look at contract renewal. And lastly, I think in the customer care side, clearly when it comes to supporting customers, artificial intelligence can be used when applied to customers' records to help deliver that better customer care, whether it be online customer care, whether it be recommendations of devices, usage patterns analysis. AI lends itself very well to that. We also see AI in devices, and that's really hand in hand with the growth of visual capability, visual processing capability, and hand in hand with textual analysis. So better search for visual information, better search for textual information. That's powered by AI, but the root of it all comes down to access to data, and the bigger platforms tend to lead the way in that area, whether they be in financial services or in health or in telecoms.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm thinking about data and its magnitude and scope. Obviously, I'm thinking about the Internet of Things and AI, so that naturally leads me to go to Mark. So Mark, in your view, what's the best that you've seen of AI in your sphere of influence?
I would say if we talk in the area of IoT, and if I narrow it down to the relevant and very timely issue of COVID, one of the applications I've seen is in the area of understanding air quality, air purification systems, and e-health. I think there's a significant role that AI can play in understanding, for example, an in-building environment, taking account of data flows from types of people, building use patterns, the air quality, external interactions with weather systems, etc., humidity levels. So I've seen there's one particular one we are working with right now in a big project in London, which is kind of benchmarking against the WHO air quality scoring system. So that's an area I think that's relevant right now. I think that whole area of how do you make COVID smart, safe building? How do you get people back to the office? And so that's a particular challenge, and I can see a number of use cases, but I can see a particular number of applications that started out life looking at energy management sustainability, but have been pivoted to deal with this COVID smart, safe concept. So I certainly think that's one area that I'm pretty excited by, particularly the ramifications of getting economies back on their feet. So that's one I would say I'd focus on for this.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm going to come to Dr. Fatmah now. I mean, as president of the AI Society, you must have seen lots of examples of AI in action. What would you say is the best or most intriguing you've seen so far? You're on mute, Fatmah.
Okay. I think so far we can see most of the application related to AI-based governmental services, and especially when it comes to security, defense, monitoring, and probably finance as well. We're going to see lots of it very soon. So AI-based services is really the trend now, and I believe it is going to be used not just for monitoring and for controlling, but as well as for health as well. It is going to be there so much, and education.
That's wonderful. I'm going to come back to those in a moment, but before I do, I'm going to go to Lubna now. Lubna, you perhaps have a slightly different take. So what struck you about the best of AI at the moment?
Well, a lot of the things have been already covered. Some of the interesting applications of AI, I think, lately, that I've come across lately, and for example, one of the companies I'm mentoring from Horizon does a lot of visual assessment of images, whether it's your biometrics, but on device. So providing on-device security that is, you can imagine that there's no network, the traversing over the network is eliminated, and retaining that assessment and onto the device. So I think on-device AI, edge AI is, you'll see a lot more of that, and I think that's quite interesting. AI in arts and music and is also very interesting, in its applications for mental health and for education, as Dr. Fatmah mentioned. But we see a lot of it obviously in the creating of customer experiences, and there's where we can talk some more about the implications of that and how that's being used. And of course, I think most interesting for me is how do we bring AI to the edge of the individual so they can augment our own human intelligence, our capability in making informed decisions and events.
Lovely. So thank you. So, well, that's the positives. Let's have a very quick look at perhaps some of the challenges. So I'm going to come back to you again, Fatmah. Have you seen any new challenges emerging as a result of the propagation of AI into our world? You're on mute, Fatmah.
I'm mute. Or I'm sorry.
That's okay.
To make it, I think more demand there will be for AI, and less expertise and very little funding. So if we can really put this into an equation that would assist us and solve this equation, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The education one, certainly. We'll come back to that. I know we will. But before we do, let me go to Mike. Same question, Mike. Have you seen any new challenges emerging as the result of the work you've been doing?
I'm not sure these are new challenges, but I think we have to start with access to data, because without access to data, we can't train algorithms to be fit for purpose. We can't make them inclusive. We can't make them innovative. And some of the access to data needs to also go across sectors to be very relevant. So if I take two of the biggest inventions of the last century, mobile and the internet, bringing those together and accessing the two data sets together can help to innovate in all sorts of different ways. We've already seen, for example, the growth in mobile payments, which are highly relevant today to consumer behavior. But we do need the intelligence to make sure fraud and cybersecurity are minimized. So a lot of this starts with access to data. I think the other area of education that Dr. Fatmah has just briefly referred to is very important as well, because sometimes there's a lack of understanding of the power of AI, how it can actually make a big difference in a positive way as opposed to in a negative way. So linking education to demonstrators and neutral arrangements. I quite like about smart cities and how to make them really smart. Sometimes Sometimes having a city data store, which is accessible by all sorts of innovators, is only going to be as good as the data that's available and the talent that then accesses that data to help remove areas such as pollution, as referred to earlier on, or help reduce congestion in city centres. So AI has got a lot of power, but it needs to be blessed with access to the data and a good understanding of how the data can be used.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that a little later on. I think that access to data and the effect it has on power. But again, in the same vein, so I'm going to come to you, Mark. You've been doing a lot of work with, as you say, the physical estate, so smart cities, smart campuses and so on. Have you seen any new challenges emerging as a result of the introduction of AI?
Probably to touch on a comment from Dr. Fatmah and Mike as well. In the area, from a deep learning, machine learning perspective, one thing you need is that data set, but almost a sort of independent agnostic data set. The challenge with AI rolling out, and particularly a point we'll come to later on 5G or 6G or Wi-Fi 6, whatever it might be, is that networks will tend to deploy that infrastructure where it's commercially most attractive. That's a logical point. Mm-hmm. The question then becomes, you have a digital divide in terms of the type of data that's being generated off those networks. And is that data set that you're using for training your machine learning, deep learning algorithms, etc., is that an inherently biased data set? So as you look at these sort of isolated smart city developments, are they truly representative of the country, the state, the people, an economic social class? Or is it a biased view from the get-go? I mean, we saw the news yesterday about Twitter and how it's biasing, people in photographs, people of a white skin color, because it was fundamentally a platform developed by white middle-aged men, pretty much. So, you gotta grab these issues, and I think there's a digital divide that could emerge because of the commercial orientation of telcos, naturally. And therefore, the data set, the sample set that we'll use to train these algorithms will generate a biased, not necessarily the most beneficial set of results. So I think that is one specific challenge, Peter, I think that we're going to have to grapple with, and that's state intervention and network deployment over time.
Well, we might get a chance to explore that in a moment, but for the final word on this particular question, I'm going to come to Lubna. So Lubna, we're rolling out AI. It's an incredibly powerful tool, but the way that the tool can be used can be for good or ill. Have you seen any new challenges emerging as a result of the introduction of wide-scale AI?
Again, I'll echo what everybody else said and what Dr. Short started with. It's nothing that's really necessarily new, but it's magnified. And those are in areas, obviously, of data and data labeling and then ethics, and whose ethics are we talking about? So the question of ethics and the question of biases and intended and unintended, and they could be biases in algorithms versus biases in data, and they could be so deeply buried in our psyche that you don't even realize that you are embedding that into the system. And the other thing would be AI for all and accessibility, and how do we ensure that AI and all the benefits of AI are accessible to people. And just pulling back to ethics, marketing and advertising, and under the banner of customer service, and in knowing your customer, how far do we go with that, and at what point do we cross the line? But I'm sure we'll talk about that some more.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to go to a question. This is obviously a mobile show, so it would absolutely be the right thing to do to talk about mobile. And what I'd like to actually do is talk about the expansion of connectivity through things like mobile internet, 5G as it becomes more widely rolled out, IPv6, possibly even things like Starlink and some of the other things going on. So first I'm going to come to Mike. So Mike, what does this expansion of mobile connectivity mean for us?
I think it means three things. I think it's, in simple terms, it's about capacity, capability, and content. Just unpacking those a little bit. Sometimes the addition of capacity improves coverage, it improves throughput. That capacity improvement should not be ignored. It also, though, does bring with it the capability of higher speeds, lower latency, more advanced standards, And having 5G AI ready networks, to me, is in that capability category. I think is much more than just hearing and seeing content. I think it's also about applications. I think it's about different styles of usage. So you can imagine businesses distributing their content and their collateral through distribution channels and their e-commerce. You can see that being much richer in a video world, in a much richer world of content, if you like. So when you blend in AI as the capability set to the capacity and the capability in the content, you can start to make suggestions and recommendations. So recommendations we get today from the internet, certain stores such as Amazon, but actually if we can get recommendations made based on location, or maybe based on usage patterns, or maybe based on areas of common interest, community, for example, that there's a lot more capability that can come through AI, provided the data is available. And it won't just be the mobile operators who are making recommendations. It's those others that may have access to common or related data sets. So the independent distribution channels might be recommending a new phone for you, or new content and breaking information for you. You might get all sorts of independent and wholesale channels with those recommendations, subject to it being reasonable to pass and share the data with the customer's permission.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm going to come next to Mark. So Mark, IPv6, Internet of Things, everything's connected, everything's aware. What do you think that means for us as we move forward into the future?
I think when we think about telecoms operators, as you say, this is, from an operator's perspective, a mobile show. What are we saying about it? What does it mean for the business model? I mean, let's go back. We talk about telephony. The idea of a telephone call. Is there such a thing as a telephone? We look at our children and how they interact with this device, and the old days of sticking a finger in a dial and moving it around on a handset device. I mean, most people, under 20, never even seen that before. So, there's this issue with this principle called insatiability. Is simply the demand that comes every time bandwidth increases and processing power increases. You see new solutions, new services rolling out. So from a mobile operator perspective, let's step back. How many of us were watching Netflix on a handheld device 5 years ago, 7 years ago? How many of us were binge watching on various streams, for argument's sake? What will that service be in the next 5 years? What solution set are we designing here? So I always come back and say, I think we talked about this before. It's not necessarily 5G, but is the explosion in growth in bandwidth, and Mike has said that underpins as a foundation stone in the growth of AI, the growth of IoT and smart cities, is underpinned by the DNA of connectivity, whether that be 5G, 6G, Wi-Fi 6. But all of this is a futile lab experiment unless we have pervasive connectivity that is not just aimed at the top end of society, but that, back to Dr. Fatmah's point, is spread across all of society. That there is no digitally disadvantaged sector of society. So I think, for me, what does it mean, the expansion of mobile internet? I think it has to be a pervasive spread of connectivity that will enable all of society to benefit, and not just a concentrated, set of islands which are smart cities dotted around. So I think that's just, for me, that's one perspective.
Okay, thank you. If we get time, we're going to come back to the smart city thing. But before we do, you mentioned in your introduction that you're studying AI at MIT, and I know that you're very interested in the way that AI will impact business strategy. So from a business strategy point of view, what should our audience be thinking about right now about AI and business strategy?
If you take the old classic model of business, what are the areas you can be successful, or how you from a business strategy, what are the ways in which you can drive success? You have differentiation, you have cost leadership, and you have focus. So when you think of those three key themes, what position should you be considering with regards to AI and the impact on business strategy? Is it going to, for example, lower the total cost of transaction? if you're using chatbots, you can use some sort of natural language processing. Is that something that allows you to take cost out of your business? One of the interesting contributions from one of the professors on the course is that AI will allow you to introduce more humanity into a banking transaction. Because it's kind of a almost bizarre logic that it takes AI to introduce humanity into a banking transaction. So, but you know, empathy in AI and empathetic AI is a separate question. But I think you have to, as business leaders, look at the impact of AI. So whether on a cost leadership, if that's improving your call center efficiency, what Mike had talked about in terms of billing analysis and churn data, are there areas there you can look at, you know, predictive analysis? And by the way, you know, I look at, you know, AI as probably being in its second or third wave. I worked in the airline industry, and back then, yield management, how much you charge for a seat, wasn't called AI. It was a whacking big spreadsheet. So I've seen the evolution of it, but I think you get to a point of you know, where you say AI can deliver a differentiation because you have some unique algorithm, you know, that allows you, in the case of Amazon, to dominate a particular, you know, e-commerce line of business. If you're a low-cost transaction, maybe it's a low-cost airline like a Ryanair, for example. So I think that there are certainly key areas where AI can have a very significant impact on the business strategy. And so I don't know if that helps, Peter, in terms of shape it, but I come back to the point of differentiation, focus, and cost leadership. AI can have an impact on all of those elements.
Yes, I think one of the things that I took away from some of the work in this is that there is an unreproducible advantage for an organization if it can use the value of the data that it has and the relationships that it has. You can't reverse engineer a relationship and replicate it easily. But I'll come to Mike, perhaps a very similar kind of question. So AI and business strategy, but you're the chief scientific advisor to the DIT. Perhaps you've got a slightly different view or something you can add from what does it mean for those national or supranational organizations as well?
Well, I think when we look at AI worldwide, we think UK is probably in the top 3 or top 4 of the players who are in AI, partly because of our university system, partly because of the amount of research we do. We can point to organizations like the Alan Turing Institute that's already getting a lot of international interest for some of the AI training and project work that they're doing. We can also point to Tech Nation, which is now about to announce its second cohort of AI startups, another 30 or so startups to be announced later on this month. So we got a lot of AI training already in the UK, a lot of international interest, whether it's in research. And to me, I think for businesses, this is also about not just the things that Mark so eloquently described. It's also about what scale do you want to reach internationally, and how do you skill up for the 21st century? How do you make sure that you're ready in some of these areas? Some of it will come through natural innovation and natural entrepreneurship, but actually having some skills capability development and accelerators, that will also help. In places like Saudi Arabia, I also wonder, where are the AI centers of excellence in Saudi Arabia, and how will they help the startups of the future? How will they help them get access to data that helps them to innovate and explore? Clearly, AI might be linked as well to some areas of data analysis as well as visualization of data. So I think it typically is adjacent to computer science, but actually alongside it, there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration. I think we also need to have principles around AI, and so some of the work done with OECD on AI principles is very helpful. And internationally will be important, because a lot of the platforms that have data on them are international platforms by their very nature. So agreeing the principles of data sharing, such as the OECD principles, is a very important step. And lastly, I think at the end of the day, AI will not know any geographic boundaries. We need to think about this internationally and think about how to collaborate in these areas. When we take some of the big industries of the UK, such as creative industries or financial services, they are serving many international markets. So they need to think about AI internationally from the start.
Thank you. So you actually asked a question, and I think I'm going to pose that to Dr. Fatmah. So Dr. Fatmah, Mike asked, the Centers of Excellence in Saudi, what kind of work is that? Because I know that this is a vital part of your national strategy for the next decade. So perhaps you could just share with us a quick insight into some of the things going on that you're aware of.
Well, I think that there is great plans here in Saudi Arabia related to the authority, the AI Society, Center of Excellence for AI. And I think there will be distributed also centers throughout the Saudi Arabia. I believe that that is going to assist in the innovation process. Also at the level of services, it will serve probably most of the universities. Once we have an AI lab infrastructure, probably the Center of Excellence also would act as an advisor for most of the businesses in Saudi Arabia here. I imagine that it would be an added value, not only at the level of business, but also at the level of economy as well, to assist in different areas in the development process, financial growth. I believe that AI Center of Excellence is not a choice anymore, and probably we're going to see this very soon in Saudi Arabia.
So thank you. So we could talk about this for a long time, but I think there are a couple of other subjects I'd love to touch upon, and I'm actually going to come to Lubna to start the next one, because I'd like to help ask you to help position this. So obviously we've talked about the power of modern AI and access to data. And we actually have just asked the rhetorical question, perhaps, will the power of AI be available equally to all? And what would be the kind of enablers or perhaps the checks and balances we need to think about? So I'm going to go to the whole panel for this, but Lubna, I'm going to come to you first, because I know that with some of the work you've been doing with the IEEE, you're thinking about some of the applications of AI in specific areas. So is it going to be available to all? Will it be an equitable relationship with AI and its application in the world?
Well, that's what we're hoping for. I think we've talked about that even yesterday, about is it going to be a human right to have access. I think the imbalance, if AI and connectivity and accessibility is not made ubiquitous, the imbalances would be gravely negatively impacting. I think we are moving towards that. With the more we support social entrepreneurship, the more we move towards meeting the SDG goals, and the more we think about the ethical implications and the field of effect of applications like autonomous systems, and it's not just artificial intelligence. As it augments our ability to make decisions and our own decisions supports, but also as we entrust it to make decisions for us, will become very critical. But I think, I hope that AI, the power of AI will be made accessible to all of us, and hopefully people like my fellow panelists will help making that happen.
Yes, I think this is something we all have an interest in. So Mark, I'll come to you next before going back to Dr. Fatmah and then Mike. So, will the power of modern AI be available to all? And what are the things that we have to put in place to make sure that perhaps it is, or that enables governments or startups or businesses to take advantage of this power?
I think, statistically, from the planet, we're talking about 2.5 billion people are not connected. There is a vast swathe of society, of the human population, who are not connected. Going back to the point earlier on, we are developing an element of sort of collective intelligence, which is combining people and computing and algorithms, but that is in a very concentrated I would describe it, economically biased way, that it tends to sit with the large economic powerhouses, large cities around the world. So I think there is absolutely a challenge. For a long time, and years ago, I've championed the idea of, the basic human right is, food, water, freedom of expression, etc. But connectivity is becoming a basic human right. And there's that phrase of, what is the internet? What was it conceived to be? Was a bicycle for the mind. You've heard this phrase used. It is not to take over how we and change our behaviors and change our thinking, as in coercively, but it's something to stretch our brains. And I think that is something I would go on and on about until the sun sets, about the need to provide absolute pervasive connectivity to all members of society. And some of the projects we're involved in, fortunately, we can see forward-thinking local government and property developers who are mandating that, social housing, low-cost housing, they have the exact same access to high-speed, high-quality connectivity as those in a very high, expensive residential development. So I think we are a long way away from, that level playing field for AI. And my fear comes back to, it becomes a very siloed thing, focused purely on a very niche set of solutions for smart cities and nothing else. So that would be a concern I would have.
Thank you. So Dr. Fatmah, I'm going to come to you next before just coming back to Mike to round off this question. Making the power of AI available to all, what's it going to take?
I think it will take bigger decision making for this, more investment. And I believe we need to have some people more educated about how to utilize all these type of power of AI and connectivity. I do agree with what Mark has proposed here. It's really going to be something that is among basic human rights, because everybody needs to get connected. Most of the services very soon that we're going to see that it is going to be activated using AI and using telecom and using without all these services, it's going to be very difficult. Of course, when it comes to intelligent cities, we are going to see this very soon around us. And the concept of intelligent city is not going to remain only limited to basic services. We are going to witness probably houses and homes that are going to communicate with us. We are going to witness intelligent architectures, intelligent environment. Without connectivity being enabled with everybody, it's going to be very difficult. So the AI based service and the AI infrastructure is really something that has to be considered when it comes to investment, when it comes to utilization of AI and making better life for everybody.
Thank you. So, Mike, I'll come to you for the final word on this question. So, what's it going to take to get the power of AI available to everyone?
Well, I think several points have already been made I agree with, but I'd like to finish with an example. So in the UK, we have the National Health Service, which is a public health service, free at the point of delivery. But even they have issues to make sure that they're offering equitable treatment in an efficient way. And 2 years ago, something was set up called NHSX, which was largely geared towards looking at new technology and new processes that would improve access to care. And in particular, NHSX set up a new AI innovation lab 12 months ago. So it's his first birthday later on this month. And they've already shown great progress in the data that was not being analyzed. By using AI, they're able to analyze it to give both more efficient treatment in some areas and also better access to treatment. There are some areas of shortage of clinicians, for example. So if you can start to analyze data to pick up trends, you can start to identify prevention techniques or maybe online techniques. And NHSX has already shown some of those with the power of AI, with the power of video, with the power of greater connectivity. So I think if we take the bigger needs of society, whether it be or health or water, we can start to apply that AI type logic to some areas such as health, as per my example. But I think we need to have clear ownership of doing it in an effective manner. So within the NHS structure, NHSX is the body to do that, and innovations are coming through in less than a year.
Wonderful, thank you, Mike. So we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to go to the next question, and this is one for our two female panelists, not because this is a female issue, but I know it's one that's of great interest to you both. We've talked about business, we've talked about strategy, we've talked about infrastructure, but we haven't really talked about our culture and the way that we express ourselves as human beings. So I'm going to come to you first, Dr. Fatmah. How can AI engage in our human culture, our creative side, our soul, if you wish?
Well, I think there is a lot to be said when it comes to this. As Lubna has mentioned at the very beginning, that AI is going to be a vehicle for our culture, for arts, for music, and maybe for more concentration in the future, because with playing certain musics and maybe assisting us in, as Mike has mentioned, to have better health, improved services. So all this is very important for us, but it is more important also to understand the limitation of AI and how we can deal with it, how we can engage with AI when it comes to dealing with different, for example, creatures like robotics or cyborgs or others that we are going to see with us in the next few years. So it is an issue that has to be considered. AI ethics is something that we need to think about more and understand how we are going to interact with it at a cultural level, how we are going to keep also our own culture not to be missed or not to be mixed with AI and maintain our life the way we would like as humans.
Thank you. And Lubna, I'm going to come to you for the final word. How can or should AI engage with our human nature, with our culture?
AI is an extent. It extends our ability to process our decision making. It also is very capable, as we all know, in writing a symphony, making a painting. But it will also, to the points Dr. Fatmah had mentioned, extend our ability to express our culture and to. I think we will be able to use AI to help us better understand ourselves and leverage the creative arts to better express ourselves and to share our cultures and preserve our cultures by sharing them and making more accessible and more understandable to others, because we don't all relate in the same way, and we don't necessarily understand how we each relate to some things. And I think the power of AI, if applied ethically and with deep consideration, can really elevate us to a much happier place at large, where we have much greater appreciation for each other's cultures, rather than imposing our own culture on each other. It's a lot of applications for AI. AI is an extension of our capacity to think.
Yes, I think it's going to be interesting to see at what point that blend becomes seamless. Well, we've just about run out of time, but before we do, I'm going to take an executive decision and we're going to run over by a moment. I'm going to ask you each for one thing you would like our audience to think about after this panel. So I'm going to start with you, Mike, if you wouldn't mind. One thing you would invite the audience to think about.
I'd like the audience to think about, if the two big inventions of the last century were mobile and the internet, how will AI help take that on to another level? I'm taken by the need for a diversity of culture and a diversity of ideas, but I'd like to know, what is the big scale invention for this century based on what we know today with AI?
Lovely, thank you. So Mark, I'm going to come to you next. Your one big thing you'd like the audience to think about?
The one big thing, climate change. Rather small little thing, but when in the concept of marginal gains, I think the audience thinking about not trying to solve climate change in one foul swoop, but all the impacts that can be had through the application of AI and robotics, for example, in a simple thing such as smart, energy efficient waste collection. But little 1%, 0.5% gains across a myriad of systems and deployments can have an overarching impact on the wider issue of climate. So I certainly would say that as a systemic threat to humanity is something where I think AI has an enormous role moving forward.
Thank you. And Lubna, I'm going to come to you. One thing you would like our audience to think about?
One thing that our audience to think about, I think, well, for me, I'm always asking people to consider, would it be how to ask themselves if they are a human of humankind or of kind human, and how would that change the decisions they make? AI has a lot of power, and what level of autonomy we give it, and how we integrate that, and how we disclose, and the transparency we establish for ourselves. So we just think about all the questions you can possibly go back and think and ask your employers, your governments, and yourself.
Lovely, thank you. And so for the final word, I'm going to come to you, Dr. Fatmah. The one big thing you would like our audience to think about?
I think to make intelligence artificial is not a question anymore. AI can now smell, write, see, talk, debate, taste, create, design, predict, monitor, and estimate based on zillions of probabilities. I believe that AI is going to grow beyond mimicking the intelligence of human to move into the intelligence of the universe. And I would like to think when we reach to that point, how that is going to affect us as human, and how we are supposed to react toward this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So all that remains then is for me to thank our wonderful panelists. So thank you, Dr. Fatmah, Lubna, Mark, and Mike, and to thank our audience for listening. And I do hope that you'll be able to engage with us later and continue this. We would love to, and I'm sure, continue this conversation for a lot longer, but sadly time is against us. So at this point, all I could say is thank you very much all, and goodbye.